Daniel was just a railroad worker from Siberia before a fake narcotics case forced him into the Russian army. Weeks later, he found himself trapped in what Russian troops called the Vovchansk Death Squad, a frontline nightmare with almost no training, no maps, and barely any ammunition. Under constant FPV drone attacks, exhausted soldiers drank homemade alcohol, suffered mental breakdowns, and eventually began executing each other inside abandoned buildings. One former Wagner fighter bragged about 150 kills before being shot in the head by his own comrade. By the end, Daniel no longer feared Ukrainian forces. Most he feared the men standing beside him. And when Ukrainian troops finally stormed the burning building, surrender felt safer than remaining with his own army. Daniel never dreamed of becoming a soldier. Like millions of others, he was slowly cornered into war. He grew up in the rugged Transbaikal mountains of Siberia, where the wind carried the scent of pine and iron. For years, he worked on the railroad fixing tracks, loading freight, living a modest life in a small wooden house with his mother. His dreams were simple: a steady paycheck, maybe a family one day, and quiet evenings under the vast Siberian sky. He was just an ordinary young man with an ordinary future. Then, everything collapsed. A fake narcotics case was pinned on him. The evidence was planted, the pressure from local police overwhelming. Terrified of years in a brutal Russian prison, Daniel fled to Street Time, Petersburg, and enlisted in the army as his only escape. For him, the army did not initially feel like patriotism. It felt like escape. At first, it seemed he had found safety. Assigned to a rear artillery unit, Daniel enjoyed hot meals, better conditions, and distance from the front lines. For a few months, he breathed easier. Maybe, he thought, he could survive this war after all. That illusion shattered in a single moment. After a heated argument with his commander, Daniel was immediately transferred to Infantry Regiment 82 as punishment. In the Russian military system, one argument could instantly turn a rear area soldier into disposable frontline meat. They sent him to a unit the Russian soldiers themselves grimly called the Vovchansk Death Squad. The deployment was brutal in its simplicity. No proper maps, no meaningful training, almost no ammunition, just a direct order: cross the river at night and take the house on the other side. The mission sounded less like military planning and more like human disposal. And the moment Daniel crossed the river into Vovchansk, the war stopped feeling human. In Vovchansk, the sky itself had become hostile. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel and a five-year-old soldier everyone called grandfather waded across the cold river. Thick mud sucked at their boots. Icy water rose to their chests. Distant explosions lit the horizon in flashes of orange. Above them, the constant buzzing of Ukrainian drones sliced through the night like mechanical hornets. The drones did not merely kill people, they hunted them. One moment, grandfather was breathing heavily beside him. The next, a sharp whistle ended in a violent explosion. Shrapnel tore through the air. Grandfather collapsed without a sound, blood spreading across the dark water. Daniel froze, his mind blank, body locked in shock. He wanted to scream, to run, but could only stare as the old man's body floated away. From that point on, everything unraveled. Daniel wandered from bunker to bunker through abandoned ruins, joining fragmented groups of soldiers. Command had collapsed. No one knew the full picture. Units moved like ghosts, disconnected and leaderless. These were the damned, punished troops, violent criminals released from prison, ethnic minorities promised Russian citizenship in exchange for their lives, and deeply unstable men pushed to the edge. Vovchansk no longer felt like an army. It felt like society's broken fragments abandoned inside a ruined city. The psychological decay had already begun. Eyes grew hollow, conversations turned short and paranoid. Every shadow, every sound made fingers tighten on triggers. And perhaps this is what prolonged industrial warfare eventually does to human beings. Because wars do not only destroy buildings or armies. Eventually, they begin destroying trust, identity, morality, and even the ability for people to safely exist beside one another. So tell me, at what point does a military force stop functioning like an army and start functioning like a psychological survival nightmare instead? But the true nightmare of Vovchansk began only after Daniel's group found shelter inside an abandoned house. The abandoned house was supposed to protect them from the war outside. Instead, it became something far worse. 6 soldiers took shelter inside the half-destroyed 2-story building. For the first time in days, there were walls around them and a roof overhead. No immediate drones, no river crossing, just the illusion of safety. They sat in the dim living room, exhausted bodies leaning against cracked walls, sharing the silence like a fragile gift. But the pressure never left. Fear, trauma, sleeplessness, paranoia, and crushing isolation brewed inside them. To cope, they drank homemade alcohol, a harsh, chemical-smelling brew scavenged from abandoned cellars. It burned their throats and loosened their tongues, but it also stripped away what little restraint remained. Among them was Shah, a former Wagner fighter who constantly bragged about his 150 confirmed kills. His stories were told with cold pride, as if violence had become just another trade. The others listened, knowing the numbers were probably real. Then Shah got drunk, really drunk. He suddenly raised his rifle and started shooting inside the house. Bullets ripped through walls and shattered windows. Plaster rained down. The men dove for cover as laughter and gunfire echoed in the confined space. The men inside the house no longer behaved like soldiers waiting for orders. They behaved like predators trapped inside the same cage. The most dangerous of them all was Senna. Quiet, cold-eyed, and unpredictable, Senna slowly became the terror figure of the group. Everyone orbited around him in fear. The breaking point came fast. After a drunken argument, Senna raised his pistol and shot Shah in the head without hesitation. The body slumped. Silence swallowed the room. No one moved. No one spoke. After the first murder, nobody inside the house truly believed morality still existed there anymore. Hours later, Senna turned on Kit. He shot him in the leg first, then watched him crawl and beg for his life. Senna eventually put a bullet in Kit's head while the others stared in numb horror. The war outside had already destroyed the city. Now the war inside the house was destroying whatever remained of the men themselves. Daniel and Schmemmel exchanged a single terrified glance. They realized they were next. The air grew thick with the understanding that murder had become inevitable. And eventually, survival demanded something Daniel never imagined he would have to do. In Vovchansk, survival eventually became a choice between killing and waiting to be killed. That night, the house was swallowed by total darkness. The only sounds were shallow breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. No one slept. Daniel sat with his back against the cold wall, heart pounding, listening to every movement in the shadows. Sina's presence filled the room like a predator that hadn't yet chosen its next victim. The air felt heavy with unspoken knowledge. Someone would die before morning. There were no good choices left, only mathematics. The battlefield had reduced morality to mathematics. Daniel's hand tightened around his rifle. In the suffocating silence, he made his decision. He raised the weapon, aimed at the dark silhouette of Senna, and pulled the trigger. A single shot cracked through the house. Then came absolute silence. No cheers, no relief. Only a hollow emptiness that settled deep in Daniel's chest. The act brought no victory, just the dull realization that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He and Schmemmel dragged the bodies to the back room and sealed the door. The house now held only 2 survivors. They were no longer soldiers fighting for a cause. They had become animals, surviving one breath at a time. And after Senna died, the house became quieter but never safer. By the end, Daniel and Schmemmel no longer felt like soldiers. They felt like hunted animals. They survived on rainwater collected in rusty cans, scraps of food scavenged from abandoned kitchens, and batteries stripped from fallen drones. The house remained wrapped in permanent darkness and crushing silence. Days blurred into one another. They spoke little, communicating mostly through glances and nods, their bodies slowly wasting away in the ruins. Their biggest fear was no longer the Ukrainians. Every footstep outside the house sounded dangerous because they no longer knew whether Russians or Ukrainians frightened them more. Then the Ukrainian advance reached their street. Mortar fire rained down. The house caught fire. Flames climbed the walls as Daniel and Schmemmel crouched in the smoke-filled basement, coughing, certain this was the end. When Ukrainian soldiers finally stormed the building, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: relief. He raised his hands without hesitation and surrendered. In enemy captivity, Daniel finally felt safer than he had among his own side. And that final irony may reveal something deeply terrifying about the psychological collapse inside Vovchansk itself. And perhaps that is the most horrifying part of this entire story. Because the true damage of prolonged war is not measured only in destroyed buildings or lost territory. Eventually, war begins destroying trust, morality, identity, and even the ability for human beings to safely exist beside each other. And if you're still watching this story, it's probably because Vovchansk no longer feels like a battlefield. It feels like the psychological collapse of an entire system. And that collapse may ultimately become one of the darkest legacies of this war. The tragedy of Vovchansk may not be how many soldiers died there. It may be how many psychologically stopped being human before they died. The ruined streets still stand as they did in the beginning: collapsed apartment blocks leaning like broken teeth, black smoke drifting over craters, destroyed stairwells open to the sky, and the endless buzzing of drones above empty buildings. Underground, only silence remains. Daniel's story is one fragment of a much larger horror chain. False promises of heroism, a punishment transfer into hell, relentless drone terror from the sky, growing paranoia in the dark, cold-blooded murder among comrades, the final act of survival killing, and the shocking relief of surrendering to the enemy. Long industrial wars like this do not just destroy armies physically, they destroy them psychologically first. The most terrifying battlefield transformation is not when soldiers begin dying. It is when soldiers begin losing the ability to recognize each other as human beings. Vovchansk is no longer just a military battle. It has become a symbol of psychological collapse, a place where the war inside the mind proved more lethal than the war outside. And perhaps that is why the ruins of Vovchansk feel so haunted tonight. If you want more deep war documentaries that go beyond headlines and uncover the psychology, human collapse, and hidden realities inside modern conflict, stay with the channel. Because the most important stories of war are often not about victory or defeat. They are about what prolonged violence slowly turns human beings into. And somewhere beneath the ruined buildings of Vovchansk, the echoes of frightened soldiers killing each other in the dark may continue haunting this war long after the shooting finally ends.